Hey folks, not feeling awesome here, but I'm going to do my best to make it through this lecture just to give you a little bit to go alongside the PowerPoint that you are reading for today. So, what are we talking about? Well, we have spent like a lot of classes talking about what I call grassroots organizing. That is, like, if you look at society as a whole, this is bottom-up organizing. We looked at cool-ass organizations, we looked at really badass reformers, we looked at consciousness-raising groups, and in so doing, we've sort of ignored the top-down politics. I mean that we've ignored presidential politics for like 40 years. So we're going to actually go back and recap some of that. And the reason that I find it really important is because, well, if you're going to understand what those activists were doing, like if you're going to understand what MLKJ was doing, you have to understand the narrative that they were speaking to. And the narrative that they were speaking to was the narrative of political power, institutionalized political power. So basically, that's what we're going to do. We're going to cover presidents. Actually, not Johnson. Actually, I think we're going to go all the way back to Truman, to Jimmy Carter. And it's going to be a pretty quick overview of some of those presidential politics. But in it, I want you to start to think about the differences between political parties. And that's really the focus here. Because we are going to talk on Wednesday about the rise of something called the New Right, which is against the New Left. So I want you to think about how political parties are changing and condensing since the Great Depression. There we go. I've got a tongue. The Great Depression. Since we talked about that, you saw that the Democrats were the super big government, pro-spending, really wanted to involve in the economy, and Republicans were very hands-off. Those are still the political parties, but how do those political parties adapt to the Cold War? How do they adapt to the economic changes after the Cold War? And how do they play out in the office of the presidency? That's basically where we are heading today. Takes forever the first time. You know this. Switch, switch, switch. Come on. You think I'm crazy. This is actually not on me. Ugh. Okay. Haha, there we go. So, things that you need to understand. We're going to start using the terms conservative and liberal. What are they? How do they play out in the fight for the presidency? How do they associate themselves with either the Republican or the Democratic parties? These are things I want you to start thinking about. What's the difference between conservative and liberal politics? What does it mean to be conservative? And what does it mean in 1950 versus what does it mean in 1980 versus what does it mean today? That's also something I want you to start tracing out. And versus what does it mean to be liberal? Mostly we've talked about the liberal people. We're going to talk about the conservatives now. What did Americans consider to be the essential role of the presidency? This is important because that role changes. What we expect the president to be and do changes. How are people experiencing that? What do they think that the president is responsible for? As the commander-in-chief, as the head of the executive branch, what is the president supposed to do? That changes. And then all of you, I'm sure, have heard multiple jokes about Nixon and corruption. Yes, Nixon was terribly corrupt, but how did that corruption actually influence the broader course of history? And let's look at some of the other stuff that happened during Nixon's presidency as well. And we're going to start tracing out a broader story here about what role the United States played in the Middle East, because that's increasingly where the site of the Cold War would be, and that's where we're going to be transitioning to in the next few weeks. Savvy? Awesome. Let's get going. Okay, so we're going to have to go back a little bit here for like a long way, and then we are going to get into the presidential story that we are actually looking at. If you remember, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the president for like frickin' ever. He was the president through the Great Depression. He was the person that instituted all of those really cool reforms like the Works Progress Administration. He also remained the president during World War II. In fact, he's the only president that served too many terms, and the reason that we have that constitutional clause that says that you're not allowed to stay president forever. The only reason that he left office was because he had a stroke and he died. So he left office towards the very end of World War II when his vice president, Harry Truman, took over the office. Truman would be elected also on his own merits. Truman's the one that ended up being responsible for dropping the atomic bomb. He's the one that guided the United States through the post-war period. And then he was succeeded by Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower was a hero from World War II who was fairly popular. Eisenhower was a Republican. That election in 1952 is actually pretty interesting because Democrats had managed to keep the office of the president for a really, really long time, and it was pretty impressive. But Eisenhower was not like a super Republican. He actually used to belong to the Democratic Party. That election in 1952 is interesting for a couple of reasons. So Eisenhower ran on this platform of being like a super supported general. He ran by saying, I'm going to follow a lot of what the Democrats have done. I believe that this has been good. And he argued that you needed to be aggressive in the Cold War, otherwise World War II didn't make sense. And people really believed him when he said that, him being a general from the World War II, right? He ran against an interesting dude, Adlai Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson was a Democrat. He actually didn't really want the nomination. Truman kind of forced it onto him. He very much so said that the United States was too focused on the Red Scare. They were violating civil rights. He was fairly focused on saying that people should be conciliatory to the civil rights movement, but the moment was just not right for that. He couldn't get a lot of support for that reason. So one of the interesting things that you see here is actually that Adlai Stevenson has a lot of support in the southern states, and this is the part where I would ask you in class why you think that is. And the reason that is because Stevenson's actually getting a significant amount of the black vote that's being mobilized during this time through the civil rights movement. Now, I am going to get something stuck in your head, because this is also an interesting moment in campaign politics for another reason. Would you like to watch a cartoon with me?
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John or Dean or Harry, let's do that big job right. Let's get in step with the guy that's hep, get in step with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We got to get where we are going, travel day and night for president. Let Adelaide go the other way, we'll all go with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody.
So I'm not sure if you heard that, but they said, well, Adelaide goes the other way, we all go for Ike.
Like Ike for president, hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington, we'll take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country.
Okay, why did I play that for you? Because there's basically nothing in it. Well, that's actually why I played it for you. I think that it's interesting to see the ways that, oh no, crapola, I did it again. Sorry. Interesting to see the ways that campaign movements kind of changed. And you can see that that one is pretty empty. It's pretty devoid of argument. Basically, it's this get stuck in your head, go for Dwight. And he did win in that election. And he entered the age of what he called modern republicanism. So Dwight Eisenhower was a Republican, but of course he was a Republican that used to be a Democrat. And so he took the needs and concerns of Democrats very much into hand. He claimed, in fact, that he was conservative when it comes to money and liberal when it comes to human beings. This is a stance that many people try to take. It's actually a really hard one to take, though, because the question is, okay, so how do you be conservative when it comes to money and liberal when it comes to human beings when you're looking at things for social welfare? So that would become a question that became much more part of the conversation after his presidency. But he was pretty well liked. He said that he was going to, be conciliatory to the kinds of programs that Democrats wanted. He didn't get rid of those things. Basically, by this time, you can't touch Social Security, or you will never be popular again. So he did a couple things like that, national park system. But essentially, it became clear through Eisenhower's presidency that it wasn't really certain what that meant. Fiscal conservatism, there we go. Fiscal conservatism and social liberalism, that was pretty unclear. So because he sort of straddled the lines between both, Ike's presidency actually really showed that those two were getting pretty opposite to one another. Think about them this way. So increasingly after World War II, these are the ways that we understand republicanism versus Democrats. Republicans wanted a really aggressive Cold War policy. They really wanted to see people going after the Soviet Union. They were almost war hawkish in that they would rather have direct confrontation with the Soviet Union than see things like the space race, like other things in terms of technological races. They worried about young people, this hippie revolution, the new left that was increasingly becoming vocal. They despised any communism. They despised the government interference in the economy, things like social welfare, right? They really didn't like those things, and this is why many Republicans did not like Dwight Eisenhower, even though he was a Republican. They associated communism with race equality. Remember those signs that I showed you that said race mixing is communism? They associated that, associated integration with the fear of communism and really tried to blend the two of those together. They supported law and order, but law and order was often code for coming down very strict and harsh on Black communities to cope with things like race riots and drug abuse. And so you can sort of see the Republicans want that. The crux of it is really that the Republicans want that 1950s vision. They want that ordered suburban world, and they saw a very particular kind of government that structured that. Democrats were different. Democrats were struggling to define themselves as a party. If you remember a long time ago, some of the Democrats that are old guard Democrats are actually racist white people in the South. So they're still struggling with that wing of the party. But increasingly, the Democratic Party is turning to young people, to civil rights activists, to people who look remarkably different than those old Democrats did and look remarkably different than what Republicans are. These are people that were very supportive of state intervention in the economy. They liked things like FDR's social programs. They wanted to see them continued. They generally were wary of state police power, though, except when it could enforce civil rights, like it did in Little Rock, Arkansas. They were not particularly worried about communism as an influencing force. In fact, they thought this McCarthyism, it's overbearing and it's not actually true. They very much so wanted, and certainly there was a variety within the movement, right? But most of them were very concerned about making sure that the United States advocated for gender, racial, and class equality. They wanted to see those differences mediated. And they wanted peace abroad. Most of them did not want war. They criticized the war in Korea. They criticized not the U.S. involvement in World War II, because it's pretty difficult to criticize that, but they criticized Korea. They understood that the Cold War was ongoing, but they wanted to figure that out through diplomacy. Ike stayed in power for 8 years, but in 1960 there was another election. And by this time, it became clear that Ike was neither really a Republican or a Democrat. Instead, the Republicans wanted someone who was far more old guard Republican. They put that forward in Richard Nixon. He was Eisenhower's vice president. He argued for extreme aggression in the Cold War. He basically didn't have a lot of tolerance for what he called hippies and the hippie revolution. And the Democrats put forward somebody else. They put forward John Kennedy. And John Kennedy was all sorts of liberals' dream. He was young, he looked good, he supported civil rights. He was actually one of the youngest people to ever run for president. He was Catholic, and people got very upset about that, particularly because many of those old guard Republicans were evangelical Christians, and so having a Catholic run for president was like a really big deal. It was actually a large part of the campaign. He supported civil rights. He was a vocal advocate for civil rights, and so this was a pretty different change. Now, I want you to take a look at this map, which I find really interesting. The reason that Kennedy could win, and this was a very close election, was because you can see that Kennedy won the South and the more liberal states in the North. The reason that happened is because you would expect him to win some of those liberal states in the North. But those states in the South, by 1960, had also seen massive voter registration drives among African Americans. And that's one of the reasons that he was able to be elected. I want you to take a look here at this oddly colored state, and that is because that's Mississippi, right? Am I an idiot? Is that Georgia? No, that's Mississippi. I'm not a moron. That's Mississippi. Anyway, that's actually a super, super racist white supremacist candidate. So you can also see that the South is starting to have that difference as well. John Kennedy is, sorry, excuse me. John Kennedy's an interesting character because he was basically the person that young people really wanted. They thought he was going to be the revolution. They thought he was going to be the guy that brought in a new era of civil rights, that did the Cold War aggressively but rationally and peacefully, that would bring in modern economic success. And he did do a lot of that stuff. If we wanted to recap some of Kennedy's presidency, we see that the Cuban Missile Crisis, it escalates, right? We see that he did continue he continued Cold War policy aggressively in the Bay of Pigs. This is probably the most aggressive thing that he did in his presidency. And we see that he supported civil rights. So, you know, I've gone over Kennedy's presidency before. I don't particularly feel like I need to go over it again here. But it's worth mentioning that basically he managed to negotiate between Republicans and Democrats in a pretty serious way because he was aggressive in the Cold War but at the same time, he de-escalated most of the time. And he was very supportive of civil rights. Of course, Kennedy was assassinated. Kennedy's assassination is not something that we cover in depth in this class. It's something that people are very concerned about in terms of conspiracy theories because they're not sure who the real shooter was and they want to get a sense of the money behind the shooter and all of that. That's not something I'm particularly interested in historically. I find it interesting that everybody is so interested in that. And I have given you a link here to the National Archives exhibit if you want to check this out. That's not in my head. The Kennedy Assassination Records Collection. This is a really interesting thing. If you are concerned about that conspiracy theory, I just wanted to point you to a place where you could get some actual documents regarding that. So if you're interested in this, this is here. You can take a look at that, but it's not something that I'm going to cover in depth in this class. Oh my God, sorry guys, that's totally my fault. I am a Neanderthal. That is on me. I'm very sorry. Okay. He was succeeded by Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson was his vice president, but Johnson ended up becoming popular in his own right because Johnson had the benefit when he was coming into office of saying, you know, this was a great tragedy. I'm going to continue Kennedy's legacy. And so Johnson ends up in office. But in 1964, when it comes time to run again, Johnson is he's the front runner because he's what Kennedy was. And so he gets most of the vote. You can see, interestingly here though, an important change. So I realize I'm going through a lot of this pretty fast. Johnson enjoys nearly universal support, but this is the first election in which a very, very right, anti-civil rights person, Barry Goldwater, actually gets a significant amount of support in the South. After this election, the South would be anti-civil rights kind of Republican, anti-government intervention Republican. That's something that really changes in 1964, even though the hands of the presidency don't actually change. This is going to be fun because I totally forget what this link is. Shall we check it out? Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president.
The people try not to blame their leaders. The people realize the enormous problems in a modern society weren't created overnight or by any one administration. And yet good, decent, honest Americans are concerned by what now seems a vacuum of moral leadership.
A vacuum of moral leadership.
They see the cancer of pornography festering.
I forgot to clarify. This is Barry Goldwater's campaign. So when I was saying that like a very right-wing kind of person arises, this is what he was arguing for, arguing against Johnson. And again, Goldwater didn't actually find too much success. We're going to talk lots about Goldwater when we talk about the rise of the right and ministers and Falwell and that. But I just want you to get a sense in this election of the kinds of things that they were arguing. Moral corruption. Kennedy, as a Catholic, was morally corrupt.
want it in their homes, in the minds of their children, why, they ask, do we have to have it on our streets?
Jazz and cars and cigarettes.
But the new America says this is free speech. The new America prospers a multi-billion-dollar business in filth. But in the new America, the ancient moral law is mocked. Nation under God. Who's he? By the new laws of the new game, out. Out of the schools, the life, the heart blood.
Okay, that is fascinating because Barry Goldwater wanted to bring, see if I can do this correctly, from this slide so I don't have to make everybody watch this again. Slideshow from current slide. Barry Goldwater is interesting because he really said that he was going to bring this like moral rightness back to the presidency. And it just, you can see the way that it gets confused with everything else, right? The growing presence of homosexuality, oh my God, the growing deregulation of speech, the integration, right? The drug use. So there's this very much so, the world today is heading down the shitter, guys, and that starts to come out in this election. Not very popular yet, though, because Lyndon B. Johnson still wins. And Lyndon B. Johnson has a really, really cool presidency. So I have linked you into a couple of things here. What you read for your homework was this speech that he gave in his 1964 State of the Union. And I wanted to show you this speech because it's really pretty remarkable in what he says counts as American, right? So I'm not going to play the whole speech for you here. But he, you know, a couple of the things that I think are really important that he says are that poverty is basically, we're not going to carry forward the plans of Kennedy because of sympathy, we're going to carry them forward because they're right. He said that he is going to create an institution that wages a war on poverty. And he says, here we go, here's the phrase that I want. This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America. I urge this Congress and all Americans to join me in that effort. It will not be a short or an easy struggle. No single weapon or strategy will suffice, but we will not rest until that war is won. The richest nation on earth can afford to win it. We cannot afford to lose it. So this is what I find most interesting about Johnson is that he basically says poverty is un-American. I mean, it's not just that poverty is bad. Poverty is bad. Children starving is bad. But poverty is also un-American. If we're going to claim to be the richest nation on earth, if we're going to claim to have beat out communism, if we're going to claim to be the panacea of everything that everybody wants, poverty belies that. Poverty shows the holes in that. So he decided that he was going to wage an all-out war on poverty. And he really did that. That war on poverty started through the Office of Economic Opportunity. The Office of Economic Opportunity is a term that I will probably ask that you remember. That would be the main governmental office that tried to figure out what poverty was and how to stop it. And it said, basically, all the other presidents before Johnson had said, we're going to stop poverty by providing jobs, right? This was the Democratic platform for a while. And that Democratic platform, like under Roosevelt, said, we'll create the Works Progress Administration. But Johnson didn't do that. He said, not having jobs is the symptom, not the cause of poverty. So we're going to allow people to have good medical care. We're going to allow them to make sure that they're taken care of when they're elderly and when they're young. We're going to make sure that they're fed, and we're going to make sure that they have access to job training. And not having jobs is no longer going to be a problem. And that war on poverty it actually started being very successful, but it was a really uphill battle. And he had to fight a lot of conservatives that didn't want to see that be the case. Johnson also waged what he called the Great Society. So if the war on poverty was dealing with the poor of society, the Great Society is strengthening things that celebrate being successful, like the National Endowment for the Arts. This is, let's give funding to academics. Let's give funding to artists. Let's try to cultivate the things that make a society great, right? That make us above and beyond barely being able to feed ourselves. But unfortunately, even though Johnson did some really badass, really cool stuff, it doesn't change the fact that Johnson presided over the term in Vietnam. And Johnson's presence in Vietnam just made most people dislike him. In fact, people chanted, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" As in, this is not an appropriate way to be part of Vietnam. And as much as he wanted to, Johnson couldn't find a way out of Vietnam. It was really challenging. Trying to negotiate the right and the left in pulling out of Vietnam was really hard. In 1968, Johnson did not seek re-election. Instead, the Republicans ran Richard Nixon. Now remember, Richard Nixon had run before. He was this kind of old guard Republicanism. He had been Eisenhower's vice president. And Hubert Humphrey runs as a Democrat. Democrats do not get much support. He said he'd continue Johnson's legacy, but nobody really wanted him to, except for the people that were thinking about the Great Society and the war on poverty, but most people were thinking about Vietnam. I forgot to mention, by the way, that Lyndon B. Johnson actually did a lot for civil rights. It was under his administration that the Civil Rights Act of 1965 and the Voting Rights Act of 1966, 64 and 65 were passed. So just keep that in mind. He said he was doing it on Kennedy's legacy, but it was also his own project. Sorry. Hubert Humphrey said he was basically going to follow in that vein. He promised to continue what Johnson was doing. He promised to make sure that civil rights were actually enforced. He promised to keep pushing for this war on poverty and economic prosperity. But because of Vietnam, it was really easy to wage war against the Democrats. Republicans really come to fruition here with Nixon. But there's two sorts of republicanism. There's the really mild republicanism. This is the Nixon-ish republicanism that's arguing for aggression in the Cold War, does not want to be like Democrats, and Nixon promises he's going to end Vietnam. There's also that strain of thought continues in the South with that very right-wing, very conservative, very evangelical strain, and you can see that here in the campaign of Wallace. Wallace does not win this election, but as a third party, he gains a significant amount. So you can see that real conservative right is coming to being. Nixon's presidency was not as radical as Republicans wanted it to be. Nixon basically presided over an era when Democrats and Republicans actually collaborated to get a lot done. So those Wallaceans there, that orange, they didn't want Nixon to do any of this stuff, but he helped to pass Title IX. He lowered the voting age to 18, which meant that people who served in Vietnam could actually vote as well as be drafted. He did not support it as much, but he did preside over busing programs that tried to integrate schools. It was during his administration that we saw the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and saw an affirmative action actually take place. So basically all of those civil rights activists that I was talking about, they have a lot of power by the 1970s. And during Nixon's administration, much of their work comes to fruition. This does not make Republicans happy. They see Richard Nixon as being far too soft on those kinds of problems. Nixon is widely liked, though, for ending the war in Vietnam. His process of Vietnamization, by which he says that we're going to transfer power over to the South Vietnamese government, is successful, it's not successful in the war. The war is unquestionably lost to the United States, but it does get the United States out of the war, which no president had managed to do. Because of that, Nixon's just immensely popular. There's no question in 1972, Nixon wins. He wins because Republicans don't necessarily put forward another candidate. They are still uncomfortable with his presidency in 1972, but they don't do all that much more. George McGovern gets Rhode Island. Nice job, McGovern. Of course, Nixon's presidency was permanently marred by the Watergate scandal. Now, the Watergate scandal is, again, not something I spend too much time focusing on because my class is much more about social history than it is about political history. But the gist of it is this. Shortly prior to the 1972 election, a bunch of people broke into the Watergate Hotel and stole information about the Democratic Party. After the election of 1972, those robbers were put on trial, and it became pretty clear that they had actually done so kind of on Nixon's orders, because they wanted to get dirt on Wallace in order to help secure Nixon's election. After all, Nixon did not think that he was going to do this well in the election, because if you remember, In 1968, he barely squeaked by with the presidency. So fearing that again, he really wanted to get on top of it. Those robbers got information on the Democratic Party that ended up helping Nixon in the 1972 election, and it became exceedingly clear in the trial of those robbers that Nixon was very much so responsible for that. An important precedent was set in that Congress actually subpoenaed him for the tapes that showed that. In the end, the process of impeachment started, but Nixon resigned amidst it. It never actually came to fruition. He just left office. And this made the American public crazy uncomfortable. Basically, it became clear that the FBI had a lot of information about American citizens and about the office of the president, and nobody knew that they had that much power. It became clear that the president was making deals with, or was informing the CIA of what to do, and that wasn't being released to the American public. And then, on top of all of that, this guy named Gerald Ford that's suddenly in office was neither the president nor the vice president, both of whom had been implicated in the scandal. Nobody voted for Ford. So, basically you get this moment when people are like, wait, what is our relationship to the federal government again, and how is this a democracy? So people are very concerned. In 1976, Gerald Ford runs again. He downplays the threat of the Soviet Union. He says, we need consistency right now at this moment in politics. But he also does something that totally screws him over, which is that he pardons Nixon. And that was a bad move because nobody really forgave Nixon for Watergate. Jimmy Carter runs. He says that he is an outsider. He was a born-again Christian, so he gets the support from that particular vote. You can see here that Ronald Reagan actually gets a small percentage of the vote too. That becomes important in 4 years in the 1980 election. And Jimmy Carter enters the presidency in 1976. He would serve 1 term. Jimmy Carter has a rather lackluster presidency overall. Domestically, he had this great idea. He thought he was going to manage to negotiate between the right and the left by turning nuclear power into nuclear energy. Unfortunately, that didn't work all that well because there were a couple of major accidents with radiation that made people very nervous about nuclear energy. Fun fact, I actually grew up within spitting distance of 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, and when I was a kid, this makes me sound super old, but trust me, they continued this forever. When I was a kid, they would give us quinine pills because apparently that helps with radiation. It doesn't. And we had drills of getting under your desk, which also doesn't help with radiation. But I did grow up around 3 Mile Island. And 3 Mile Island was one of the places that suffered a nuclear leak. So there was a lot of concern. Jimmy Carter's policy was supposed to mediate between Democrats and Republicans, and it ended up actually not making anybody happy. Abroad, Carter also didn't do all that right. He had some really interesting ideas. Like Nixon, he encouraged a relationship with China. This was fairly good, except that people are very mixed on that. It makes you look like you're soft on communism. He also followed a human rights campaign, which is also pretty cool. He basically said, we cannot ignore the human rights violations of people that we pretend to be allies to. That's also pretty badass. And he presided over the Camp David Accords, which really sought to find peace in Middle Eastern conflict. So he did a lot to try to make relations abroad look good, but they were soured by the Iran crisis of 1979. The Iran crisis of 1979 is a little bit complicated. Basically, there was a Shah in charge of Iran, and he was deposed. That Shah had had good relationships with the United States. After he was deposed, he got sick, and Carter invited him to seek treatment in the United States. This angered all of the students in Iran who had been part of the people to dispose of the Shah. And so they actually put the embassy under, they held the people in the embassy hostage. And it was a long time before that could be resolved, and it wouldn't be Carter that ended up resolving it. So this just really made his international affairs look bad to Americans. There was also an issue that was growing increasingly important, which is that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. They invaded Afghanistan because the government of Afghanistan was no longer sympathetic to communism or to the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union really starts to show that they are willing to be militarily involved in the Middle East. The United States tried to address the issue diplomatically. That didn't really work. So this also makes Carter look like he's just kind of soft when the Soviet Union is increasingly aggressive. Basically, Jimmy Carter has one of the lowest approval ratings. The scene was set for this conservative revolution that I'm going to talk about in your next class. Democrats didn't like him because he didn't do all that much to further the Democratic agenda. Republicans didn't like him because he looked like he was soft on communism. Nobody liked him because a lot of bad stuff happened during his presidency. One of the lowest rated presidents ever. In fact, by 1980, people really wanted to see the office of the presidency be something completely different. That is what we're going to get to when we talk about Ronald Reagan. But before we talk about Ronald Reagan himself, I want to make sure that I talk about the rise of this social belief in the religious right. That is where we're heading. Make sure that you do your discussion forums. You're all awesome. I will talk to you later.